Hey everyone, if you love the Sus Talk podcast, make sure to also check out other pods across the HSP network. Take a listen to amazing shows such as Subway to Shea, Third Floor Lounge, HSP, and Adventures with Trendsetter. Make sure to hit the notification bell and subscribe today so you don't miss out on all the great podcasts on HSP. Welcome to the Sus Talk podcast. I'm Susumu Araki. The NFL offseason is underway. We've seen a lot of wheeling and dealing, major pieces moving across the league to different destinations, or even some players going right back to their teams. You know, it's been all over the place. This offseason has been crazy, and joining me to break it all down is the host of the Straight Up Saints podcast and writer for The Spun, Chris Rusvoglou. Chris, welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me, Sus. Like you said, fun off season, a lot of big deals so far. Excited to talk about everything.
So let's immediately go into this by simply asking you, which team's off season has been the most interesting to you? Because I think right off the bat, everyone's going to say the Patriots because of that spending splurge. But I can't give like a grade on that because this is really the first time we've seen Bill Belichick spend money in free agency. He never does this, so I have to give this an incomplete grade initially because I actually want to see how these new players, perform in Belichick's system, because he likes to develop and grow players and draft his stars. He doesn't like to just go after other people's stars. That he lets stars from his team go to get bigger money, because it's just like sometimes he's just like, it's not worth it. Like Richard Seymour is an excellent example of this. He could have kept Richard Seymour, but he didn't. He let him walk to Oakland. This to me is a major shift in New England.
Yeah, it is. And the funny thing is, you mentioned them, what's most interesting, and the Patriots obviously come to mind. I actually thought they were almost a little bit overhyped because some of the acquisitions they made, whether it was Kendrick Bourne or it was Nelson Agholor, I kind of feel like they overpaid for guys that aren't that talented. Like Nelson Agholor had a good year, but $13 million a year when the rest of the wide receiver market was struggling was kind of interesting to me. I'm going to give you a team that's not the Patriots though. And you talked about interesting, and I found the moves that they all made, one, productive and good moves, and two, I just can't wait to see how they work in that system. I think what Washington did was really interesting because you added a really exciting piece in Curtis Samuel. And if you're a fantasy football owner, and you and me love to play fantasy football, Curtis Samuel and Terry McLaurin, those are two great pieces. And then it comes down to, well, how does their other big free agency acquisition, Ryan Fitzpatrick, play? Because that's a really interesting wide receiver combo. And I'll just throw out too, they did sign William Jackson the third. He's a really talented corner. But the Fitzpatrick move and Curtis Samuel, that's really interesting to me because now you have Curtis and Terry. You also have Antonio Gibson, a really good young running back, and you also have Lance Thomas, a decent tight end, a pretty solid tight end compared to what everyone else around the league has. So I'm interested in what you think about that, because I thought what they did was pretty intriguing.
It's amazing, right? Ryan Fitzpatrick just is casually on his ninth team. It's fantastic. Like, he's really embracing this mercenary style of career that he's had. Like, he is the journeyman of journeymen. And I can't wait to see what they do. I wonder if they draft a quarterback anyway, because Ryan Fitzpatrick is he's up there in age. So, and despite how much I want to believe in Taylor Heinicke, I just know that he is not the long-term solution. He's never going to be. And maybe Taylor Heinicke could learn from Ryan Fitzpatrick, and he'll teach him the best way to continue your career is by simply moving on to whatever team, because every team needs a capable backup quarterback. Every single team. Heed my words, young Heinicke. Heed my words.
No, I totally agree. And the funny thing is, their quarterback depth chart is all guys that people like, but we don't necessarily love them. Like, look, Fitzpatrick's really fun, but he's not a franchise quarterback. Kyle Allen's had some fun moments here, but he's not a franchise quarterback. And then Taylor Heinicke, like you said, I mean, that playoff game was so fun to watch and everyone was going nuts over this guy, but he's probably not a franchise quarterback. So to your point, well, what if a guy like a Mac Jones or a Justin Fields falls just a little bit and Washington from pick 19 says, hey, we're going to shoot up this draft board a little bit and get one of these guys? I think it'd be a smart move for this team.
You assumed thinking that Justin Fields is going to fall all the way down to like 10. that's a side note. Like, I don't understand the hype around Zach Wilson. Maybe I will once I really get to see his actual like
Mhm.
tape, but I still think that Fields is like the second best quarterback in this upcoming draft, just because we have a body of work with him for like at least 2 years of work that we know for sure. Whereas with Zach Wilson, it's been really like 1 year. It's like, with Joe Burrow was like 1 year. We only had like that 1 year of excellent quarterback play, which I'm not. I know it's weird. Like, we're comparing like him to Joe Burrow, but like the point stands is that it's comparing one excellent year compared to two great years.
Yeah, no, totally. And you know what? To your point with Justin Fields, we're also seeing 2 years at the highest level too. He is playing against top tier teams week in, week out. And I actually, when I looked through the quarterbacks and when I was grading them, obviously we're putting Trevor 1, but I think even if I put Zach 2, I think it's 2A, 2B with Justin Fields, because Justin Fields, I wanted him to look good in the college football playoff, and his best game was in the college football playoff semifinal against Clemson. So when someone asks you to deliver and you do deliver, can't really ask for any more. I mean, and he was injured that game too, and he finished with 6 touchdown passes. So I agree with you. I don't think he's going to fall, but if he does, and this just goes back to the Washington thing, I mean, I know they tried out an Ohio State quarterback and it didn't work with Dwayne Haskins, but they're two different dudes. And I would love to see what he does. I know some people have linked Justin to like Carolina, San Francisco, if he falls, stuff like that. I think this guy might be one of those quarterbacks where, yeah, he does slip a couple of spots, but what if it actually works out for the better because he falls in a better spot? Like that is possible.
That is true. And I will say that I really wanted to believe in Justin Fields being able to be at Alabama. I was like, the moment he injured himself, I'm like, ooh, we've seen this before. We've seen this before where a quarterback got injured in the playoffs and then they somehow win the national championship. Joe Burrow got injured during the playoffs and he won a national championship. And I'm pretty sure like Jalen Hurts got injured and then that's how we got two in the first place, all that stuff. But, that side note on that, I would say it's kind of interesting with Washington because they already have like this set defense. They have the most dominant front seven in the league. They have all these like playmakers on their team. And you talk about McLaurin, you talk about Gibson, you're adding Samuels, you have Logan Thomas, who had a breakout season at the tight end position. And they also have one more guy, like McKissick actually was incredible last year. And I'm already instantly regretting it because the Seahawks could have kept him. They easily could have kept him, and they just let him go for some reason. And this team is always going to be like that one quarterback away. It's kind of a shame that we don't have like a young quarterback with this team because Washington could easily just walk and win the NFC East every year if they had a competent quarterback.
Yeah, I totally agree. And that's why the incentive for them should be to move up, because you are paying a couple of high prices. You are paying Curtis Samuel a lot. You're going to have to pay Chase Young a lot of money, obviously, when he's due for a new contract. Why not get that rookie quarterback who you're not going to have to pay that much for the first 4 years of his deal? It works out. And this is a very winnable division. The Eagles, obviously we joke around with our guy, Nick Ferria from Hofstra, but the Eagles are in a bad spot right now. The Giants aren't in a bad spot, but they're not in a great spot necessarily because they don't know if their young quarterback's the answer there. And then you have Dallas, which, all right, they have the quarterback position figured out, but what other position outside of quarterback and wide receiver does Dallas have figured out? Probably not many. So I do agree with you. I would love to see young quarterback on this team. Ron Rivera did a great job in his first year with them. And the time is now. Like you said, they got to the playoffs strictly off of their pass rush for the most part. I mean, they were throwing out Alex Smith, Dwayne Haskins, Kyle Allen, Taylor Heineke. They used 4 different quarterbacks. And when you have 4 quarterbacks, you don't have one. That's usually the thing there. So I would love to see it. I don't know who the guy would be for them, whether it's Mac, whether it's Justin, maybe it's Trey Lance. I don't know if they like any of these guys, but if they do, package pick 19, package next year's first, maybe this year's second, go get your guy, because there's not many holes on this roster. There really aren't.
That is true. And I want to kind of touch on this before I get to this next point, which is that we talk about like cap space. We talk about cap space. And I remember you consistently tweeted this throughout the past few weeks, which is the cap is a myth. It is a complete myth. And I want you to explain this to me, what you mean when you say the cap is a myth, because I know that since you cover the Saints, you have extensively been covering like, well, they're over the cap. How are they going to get under the cap? And we've seen over the last few years, like the best teams in the league have been extremely creative with how they've managed their cap space. we've seen like this with the Chiefs last year, like they had this whole barrage of just extending all their stars, and they were thinking like, how are they going to afford any of these people? And in some ways, we're already seeing like the casualties of like the moves that they made last offseason. They had to cut both of their starting tackles, and they had to refortify through free agency again. So when you say the cap is a myth, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, I mean, when I say it, a lot of the times I do it just for like the take on it. But this is the way I view the cap, because the cap obviously is real to a certain extent. The salary cap, though, cannot be an excuse for a team not getting a guy. And what I mean is the smart GMs know how to maneuver the numbers. And we saw with the Saints, they were $100 million over the projected cap for this year. And yes, they did have to cut Emmanuel Sanders, and they did cut Quan Alexander, and they got rid of Janoris Jenkins, and they cut Thomas Morstead. And there were some pieces that they had to part ways with to get under the cap. But at the same time, people assume because they're $100 million over, they weren't going to be retaining a lot of guys, and they'd lose Marcus Williams and they'd lose Jameis Winston, which they didn't lose two guys that they prioritized. They actually, while they were over the cap, used the franchise tag on Marcus Williams. Like, that just goes to show, for starters, that you can maneuver that number whenever you want. They were, I believe, $47 million over the cap when they used the franchise tag, which pushed them back another $10 million, and they still found a way to get around it. And it's not just the Saints, the Rams too. $32 million over the cap before the start of the new league year, and they still got a 4-year extension done with Leonard Floyd. So what I mean is, it is real. You want to be smart with your money, but sometimes I think teams use the salary cap as an excuse for why they're not being that aggressive. Like, I think when the Jets or the Jaguars finish the free agency period and you realize they still have $20-30 million to spend, it's, we didn't really like this guy, or this guy wasn't available, or we'll save the money for next year because you never know with the cap. I just think good teams find a way to figure it out. And even your team with Seattle, I mean, Seattle wasn't in the best financial situation. They did trade and get Gabe Jackson. They did re-sign Chris Carson. Like, I've seen teams figure out a way to keep the guys that they really want to keep in town while not having to really just gut out their whole team. Like, it's possible to do both. So when I say the salary cap's a myth, it does exist. You do have to make certain sacrifices, but you don't need to gut your roster the way certain people think you do.
That's what I was so fascinated. Like, the Rams offseason for me, like, they just signed Deshaun Jackson recently, and they're accommodating by getting Matthew Stafford. I just always think to myself, like, when you extend these guys, like, especially once you get that extension on your starting quarterback, you feel like a sense of limitation. But if you have like a firm understanding of how the salary cap works, you can maneuver around that. You can maneuver around giving your quarterback a big payday, which he's very much deserves. So, like, when you see like the extension that Dak signed, like, the first initial thought that I had was, oh my God, how are they going to build this roster now that he's taking up so much of the cap? But if you actually think about it, if you have a better understanding of how the cap works, you're just like, you're not as worried as any other person would be.
Yeah, absolutely. And, we go back to Dallas, and this is also what people don't realize with the cap. So Dak signs a 4-year, $160 million deal, and then it comes out that he gets $75 million in the first year, and people are like, oh my God, they can't pay for anyone. But then you realize his cap hit is $22 million for this year. Like, the cap number doesn't equal what the average salary is. That's another problem that fans aren't understanding, because if that was the case, people would not be able to make that many acquisitions. The Patriots would have been capped off after like their 5th signing. I mean, they gave Hunter Henry $10 million. They gave Jonnu Smith like $12 million. They would have ran out of money if that was the case. But a lot of these cap hits are lowered because you're giving up money up front, whether it's a signing bonus or a roster bonus. Like, it goes back to our point. You can find ways to maneuver it. And you can also move contracts you don't want anymore, because I don't know if you had this belief, but I know I did. I actually thought at one point Jared Goff's contract was like untradeable because it was that bad, but he got moved. And not only did they move Jared Goff, they took on another expensive contract with Stafford. And then we saw Carson Wentz get traded, and the Eagles took about a $30-something million dead cap hit. Like, we are seeing teams now more than ever be flexible with the cap because there are loopholes around it. And don't forget voidable years too. That's a big thing that the Saints and the Buccaneers like to do. You're basically adding phantom years onto a contract to spread out the cap hit. Like, that's what the Bucs are doing with Gronk. They're doing it with Brady. They're doing it with Levante David. So Levante David's cap hit for this year is only like $3 million when he's one of the better linebackers in the business. It's fascinating stuff.
I was gonna get on the Bucks because their whole offseason was essentially let's keep the band back together, and they have the. I always thought initially they always had the flexibility because Brady doesn't really care how much he's being paid, not at least to the extent of some of the other star quarterbacks anyway. Because like he's been around the block and like he's always had to like restructure his contract. He's always had to take some pay cuts if it meant that like you could get like a Leonard Fournette or an Antonio Brown onto the roster. He's been willing to do it for the sake of winning. So what I saw with the Bucks doesn't surprise me. I figured that they were going to lose Chris Godwin, but I was actually shocked that they were able to retain most of the guys on their Super Bowl team. So, you know, that's another conversation for another time, just how dangerous this team is and how they could easily go for a repeat. But I want to shift over to your Saints because you mentioned that Jameis Winston re-signed with the team, and it's fascinating because Drew Brees is gone, and now it's really Jameis's show. So when you heard about the news with officially that he was going to re-sign with the team, what are your thoughts? And do you see him holding on to this position? Like basically, I'm going to ask you: is there going to be a quarterback controversy or not?
Well, when the deal first came out, I actually tweeted about it, and some people thought it was me being negative, but I wasn't. I just said I was indifferent to it. And the reason I said that was because we kind of just thought this whole year, everyone kept saying the Saints want to re-sign Winston. The Saints want to re-sign Winston. So when the Saints do that, I wasn't surprised. I was like, okay, cool. Jameis is back. Didn't think much of it. As far as the quarterback competition, I don't think so. So Sean's saying it's a camp battle, but that's what he should be saying. Like, he's not going to tell you in March, and it really serves him no purpose in March to be like, hey, Jameis Winston's our starting quarterback. Taysom Hill's the backup / Swiss Army knife, and we'll go from there. But the fact that Taysom Hill's cap number got lowered for this year, instead of $16 million, he's making $12 million, and that Jameis Winston did sign back, and that Drew Brees basically gave him a little pep talk after that playoff game, and that Sean has said that he really likes what Jameis has been doing, it does lead me to believe that Jameis is the starter. And I think for the Saints, it really matters is how many picks does Jameis Winston throw? Because that really, one, was the reason why he got knocked out of Tampa Bay, and two, why he didn't start for anyone last year. So if Jameis can keep the interception number anywhere from like 16, 17 under, and that's still a lot of picks, but let's say he throws 15 picks, I think the Saints will actually live with that. Now, if he's, the first 10 games are over and Jameis has 20 something picks, all right, depending on where the Saints are in, and if it goes to 17 game schedule, maybe for those last 7 games, they say, hey, we got to put Taysom Hill in. But I would be shocked. I don't think there's going to be a quarterback controversy. I think what the Saints are going to do is they're going to start Jameis Winston, and they're going to use Taysom Hill almost like they did with Drew Brees. But if anything, use Taysom Hill just a little bit more, because the fewer amount of times the ball's in Jameis's hands, the fewer amount of times that he'll probably throw an interception. You are taking away some of that risk. So I think that the Saints can put together a really nice hybrid offense. It's not going to be as efficient as it was with Drew Brees. They're not going to be as good in the 2-minute drill, but they could probably push the ball down the field a little bit better. And I think they can throw some defensive coordinators off. But I'm not envisioning, at least at this moment, a quarterback controversy.
I will say this: if you're Michael Thomas, you're going from 5-yard slant routes to 10-yard slant routes. And yeah, it's really nice. And I wonder who they're going to get to replace Emmanuel Sanders on the other side, because that's an important position. I want to see how this team replaces Jared Cook, who I know you've been very lukewarm on him. You've had like your ups and downs with him, and we've seen how like Adam Trautman. I can't wait to see how he does. Maybe he steps into that role, but this Saints team, there's a lot of interesting things going on with this team, and I'm looking forward to the Jameis Winston Reclamation Project officially being greenlit. So I want to wrap this podcast by going into Drew Brees, because he is officially retired. He has accepted a broadcasting gig with NBC officially. And I wanted to have you on this podcast because I want to talk about Drew Brees and what he has meant to you, because this guy has been part of your fandom for almost like most of your life, basically. So let's start off with this. What was your first memory of Drew Brees, and when did you know that this guy was going to really be a difference maker for your team and eventually win a Super Bowl?
My first memory go back to 2006 when they reopened the Dome. That was the big one for the Saints team. And now he didn't necessarily play great in that game. It was really the special teams and the defense that kind of dominated the night there. But that was the first memory of just thinking about a new team, new franchise, and kind of revitalizing themselves, not just the city, but also Drew. Because remember, at that time, his career was in question. I didn't really think, though, that Drew Brees was this like certified, I don't want to say badass, but somewhat similar to it until the 2009 season when the Saints played the Patriots on Monday Night Football and they just walloped the Patriots. And it was something that I didn't even think was going to happen and no one really was accustomed to, but the Saints beat them pretty thoroughly. I mean, Drew was throwing deep bombs to Devery Henderson. He was throwing it all around the place. And it was at that moment where I kind of thought, all right, before then I thought Drew was good. I wasn't necessarily sure if Drew was elite, but then it seemed like from 2009, and obviously that's the year they won, he took that step from good to great. And then from there on out, it's just been consistency ever since for over a decade. So that was one of my favorite moments. I think other moments too, and it's actually funny, they were playing it over the weekend. It just kind of, for me, it puts into perspective how weird his career was with this team. I want to say it was the 2015 season. The Saints played the Giants and they won the game 52-49 in overtime. And the fact that Drew threw 7 touchdowns and threw for over 500 yards, and they needed a field goal in overtime to win that game, for me was nuts, because a lot of people kind of think of the last 3 years like, okay, the Saints had a really good defense, but Drew Brees wasn't particularly great in the playoffs, which is absolutely true. Like that's not even, someone just making up crap. I agree with that narrative. Like the Saints defense has stepped up at times in the playoffs. Drew Brees hasn't played that well the last couple of years. The 2012 to 2016 teams, my God, it was like Drew was throwing for 5,000 yards and just didn't matter because the defense was so bad that they were destined to go 7-9. I feel like a lot of people just forgot about those years, but there are a lot of great moments. I look back at the game against Washington in the 2017 season. They had a fun comeback there. That's a fun one for me. And I'll obviously never forget the game they had against the Eagles divisional round. They were down 14-0. They came back. That was fun. A lot of good moments for me, but if I had to pick the one that I remember, I'm just going to go back to that Patriots game. Like I said, that was the turning point for a guy who was going to go from good to great and then from a Pro Bowl quarterback to a future Hall of Famer.
It's interesting to me because my first recollection of Drew Brees was when he signed with the Saints, because that had its own drama to it, because it was like he was being rumored to go to the Dolphins, and then he ends up on the Saints, and because of that, Nick Saban's NFL career ended. And it's also like with the Saints too, like because he signed with the team right around the time when the city was rebuilding and was still going through the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. But even like before that, this team was in like another era. It had its own kind of exciting team. They had Aaron Brooks as quarterback, Deuce McAllister was the running back, and they had a star receiver in Joe Horn. And then you shift over to the Brees era, you had this amazing 2006 run where they nearly make the Super Bowl. It was such an awesome story for like the entire season that the Saints team came back to the Superdome, dominating. Drew Brees was having an excellent, like, fresh new start with another team since he got booted out from San Diego. And then after that, like the next few years, it's a little like kind of cruising a little bit. But then you talk about that 2009 season. That's when he etched his name in history. And I feel like Drew Brees' whole legacy is like complicated. Like it's not Eli Manning complicated where we're just going to have to constantly have this whole, is he a Hall of Famer debate? But like we know for a fact Drew Brees will be in the Hall of Fame. It's now the real question that people want to know is where does he rank amongst the top quarterbacks in the league? And I know you've done a podcast on this before. I've listened to it. You've made the case, and I forget what the exact case was, but all I know is that for me, like Drew Brees at the highest is definitely in the top 5 because the only quarterbacks he's not touching is Brady and Joe Montana. So do you feel like his legacy is going to be complicated in constant debate over the next few years?
It's definitely complicated. I do agree with that. It's definitely not the 2004 draft class. Cause I mean, Eli, Rivers, and Big Ben, they have some complicated stories, but with Brees, I think he's absolutely without a shadow of a doubt. He's top 10. I don't think that one's up for debate. I do agree with you. I think the highest, and I'm not necessarily saying I'm putting Drew Brees there, but I think the highest you put Brees at most is 3, because again, I mean, how many more Super Bowls does Brady have to win before people are like, all right, that's it. He claims number 1. And then Joe, like we said, he's 4-0. He played great in those games when it mattered most. You can't touch that legacy either. I think where it gets interesting, though, is how does Brees stack up against the Marinos, the Peyton Mannings? Because I think the funny thing is Drew Brees, in terms of statistics, is kind of like a modern Dan Marino, but he does have that ring, and that does matter. The ring does matter. And then for Manning does have the 2, but Brees did surpass him basically in every statistic. Brees did beat him head-to-head in the Super Bowl. I find that argument very fascinating. I think the wild card here would also be what happens with Rodgers. If he wins another Super Bowl, I think that's going to shoot him up the rankings big time, because I think that's where people need to understand. Because a lot of people say, hey, Chris, you got to stop saying that Drew's top 5, top 7, because he only got 1 ring. Peyton Manning had 1 until that stacked Denver team basically carried him to a 2nd ring. Aaron Rodgers has been stuck on 1 just like Drew Brees for a while now, and it's not really a knock on them. It's a team game. I mean, very well, Russell Wilson won 1 very early in his career, and now I believe he's 32, and he's still stuck at 1 because, frankly, the rest of the team hasn't been as great as they've been before. Like, it's a team game, and Drew Brees sometimes didn't come up clutch in the big moments, sometimes, but more times than not, it was a weird circumstance. If it's not a Vernon Davis game-winning touchdown pass, or Marcus Williams missing a tackle, or the refs not throwing a flag, or Marshawn Lynch with a incredible touchdown run on the beast mode play. I mean, more times than not, when the Saints lost in the playoffs, their defense was the last one on the field that made that back-breaking play that basically screwed them. And I'm not saying I'm going to throw the other 52 guys under the bus. I just think context matters. And I think that's why it goes to your point. There will be a debate, because some people are going to say Brees just has 1 ring. He didn't make it back to the 2nd Super Bowl, so I'm not putting him top 5. And that's okay. That's up to them. But I think if people do use some context, I think there is a lot of wiggle room to say Drew Brees is in the top 5. Whether you want to put him 5, 4, or 3, that's up to that person. But I personally, at this moment, I wouldn't put him lower than 5, because I do think I'd put him over Dan Marino. I do think that, and again, this is going to come off wrong, I actually would put him over Peyton Manning. I've seen him beat Peyton Manning head-to-head. I've seen him surpass him in all the numbers. I think that just matters to me. And the only guys that I'll definitely put ahead of him are Montana, Brady, and then maybe John Elway. I think John Elway has a fascinating debate, but I think that Drew's legacy is going to be really interesting. I think some people are going to soften up on him because he's out, forget about what happened. Other people are going to look at the last 4 years and say, why did this Saints team win so many games but not win a Super Bowl? That's a problem for Drew. And that's definitely a fair argument, but that's kind of where I stand on it at the moment.
It's interesting because, I feel like you kind of just, completely clinched the whole Brees is better than Manning thing. Because think about it like this. Manning's Super Bowl, his first Super Bowl was against a Bears team he was facing Rex Grossman. And the whole point of context matters, I'm putting it in play here because Drew's facing Peyton Manning still relatively in his peak, and he had an excellent team surrounding him. Drew, on the other hand, I felt like and I think it also matters, with Drew, that he basically lifted the Saints franchise out of being labeled a legacy of failure and turning it into one of the better, more consistent franchises in the league today. When you think you're more likely to think the Saints are good than you did back pre 2006, because for the longest time, the Saints were a punching bag. A very long time. And then Drew comes in, they start winning games, they start cruising a little bit, and then they win the Super Bowl, and now they're just labeled consistent winners every single time. And I think that matters. It matters that you're able to come into the league and then, or come into a team and then eventually lift them to a Super Bowl and make them a mainstay as one of the better teams in the league. That matters to me.
Yeah, it does. I think it does. And you know what? I'll throw this out there too. And it comes back to the context thing. The Saints rosters weren't all that great until the last couple of years. Now, I know the 2009 team was great, but for the most part, the 2016 wasn't that special. I think they just had some crazy momentum going, and they were just fueled by something that wasn't football related. That was more than football to them. But I go to the Colts or I go to the Broncos, and I'm not knocking Peyton Manning for this, but with the Colts, Bill Polian was drafting great player after great player after great player with him. If it wasn't Marvin Harrison, if it was Reggie Wayne, if it wasn't Reggie Wayne, it was Dallas Clark. And they were just, if it wasn't Dwight Freeney, it was Robert Mathis. They were loaded on both sides of the ball. And then you go to Denver, it starts off with Manning having this incredible offense with Demaryius Thomas, Julius Thomas, Wes Welker. They had Eric Decker. And when they realized the offense wasn't working and Peyton Manning was getting older, they quickly transitioned into one of the best defenses we've seen, with Aqib Talib, with Chris Harris, with DeMarcus Ware, with Von Miller. And yeah, part of it is just great management, good drafting at the time. It's just, I think that matters too. Like, a lot of people love to hype up Mickey Loomis, myself included, but Mickey Loomis, I'm going to call it what it is. He's glorified accountant. Like, he's great with the numbers, but Sean Payton does a lot of the personnel decisions. So if Sean misses, that's on him, but Sean's not going to face any, consequences for it, because at the end of the day, he's a good head coach. So he can afford to whiff on some draft picks. Peyton Manning had better structure. I think that does matter. And it goes back to what you said. This guy went to a franchise that was basically the laughing stock of the league, built them up to the point where they're a perennial contender. Denver's always been thought of well, if we put that for the side for Peyton Manning. And Indianapolis, maybe not so much, but again, like I said, great coaching, great front office in Indianapolis. I think that matters. And I also want to throw this in there. Peyton Manning, his 2 Super Bowl losses, the first one, he did throw the pick 6 that basically put the game on ice against the Saints. Like that matters. And the Seahawks one, and very well, that game was over after the first snap. I mean, it goes over his head. The game's over. And I'm not here to blame one loss on one player, because that's not fair, because that Seattle team was just beating everyone. They beat Drew Brees and the Saints that year too in the playoffs. They were that good. But Seattle dominated from start to finish. And I feel like if you are that great, you just can't lose in that fashion in the Super Bowl. I know it might sound a little nitpicky, but I think those things matter.
Especially in if you're doing this head to head of your legacies, every little, everything matters. Every little win, every single loss that you've had matters. And God, I'm so joyous because you mentioned that Super Bowl again. Music to my ears. All right, Chris, thank you so much for hopping on. I know you're pressed for time, so I'm going to let you go and let the people know what you've been up to and how they can reach out to you.
Yeah, absolutely. So if people want, they can reach out to me on Twitter at Rosvoglu Report, ROSVOGLOU Report. Always, up to talk Saints football, regular, any NFL football, March Madness. You want to talk about the NFL draft? Let's do it. As for where they can find my stuff, they could check out Straight Up Saints on iTunes. Actually going to put a new podcast up this week, either Thursday or Friday. I'm going to kind of go through my favorite prospects, not just for the Saints, just favorite prospects in general for this year's NFL draft that I really, really like. And if they do like draft content, I've been doing a lot of Q&As with prospects like Greg Russo, Rondell Moore, Asante Samuel Jr., just kind of go through their college career, their path to the draft, some fun hobbies off the field, which players they like to study and watch. Like, for example, I know you like this one, but I was talking to Joe Tryon from Washington. He's a defensive end. And I go, okay, who's the quarterback you sack the most? And he goes, I grew up a Seahawks fan, so I want to get Russell Wilson, but he's got that good pump fake, and I don't know if I'm going to miss him or whatnot. It's fun to get in the, in the minds of these young players and see what they like. But if people want to reach out and see my content, they can either follow me on Twitter, check out thespun.com, or type in Straight Up Saints on Apple Podcasts, and they can find the Saints stuff there.
All right, everybody, that's going to do it. Do not forget to follow this podcast on Spotify, Anchor.fm, and Apple Podcasts. Thank you, everybody, for listening, and see you guys next time.